right, so that was all over the C minor chord. Then it goes to the F minor chord. When it goes to this, he bends up in that pentatonic shape. And that's basically going from the, or if you think about F minor pentatonic, you basically have the 11th fret bending up a whole step, and then he's catching the 11th fret on the E string. Now when he bends that up, again, he kind of dips the bar, and he gives it a lot of vibrato. Then that next note that he catches, the 11th fret on the E string, he bends down a half step before he gets that, and brings that up. And then he pushes it back down, so it's... So he gets that weird diving motion. So then he goes into the next section of... This is like the second fast, long, drawn-out lick that he plays. That is just really cool. I mean, these are the licks that always kind of catch our attention. The phrasing's great. All the little short, nifty licks that just work so well over the chords are awesome. But of course, our heads turn, most of us, our heads turn when we see these fast chromatic licks. And most of them, like that first one, only had a little bit of chromaticism in it. It was more just scales, intervals out of the scales and stuff. And this one's more the same. There's not a lot of chromatic movement in it. There's a few chromatic shifts in it. But the way I looked at this, it was actually in sections. There were like 4 different sections in here, and they're separated by like 16th note rests. Like it's again that saxophone phrasing where you play a bunch of notes and then you stop for a second, then you play a bunch more notes, and it's just really cool. Anyway, so the way this is played, I'm just going to go through all the notes and then we'll examine it a little. So so this basically, after he does that bend, he goes up from the 14th fret to the 15th fret on the E string. Then he does a pivot kind of thing from the 13th fret to the 15th fret on the E string. This is all on the E string. Then the 11th fret to the 15th fret on the E string. Then he does that again, 11 to 15 on the E string. So that whole thing is... Then he goes down from the 10th fret to the 13th fret on the E string. Again, that whole thing is... Then he goes, after that part, he goes from the 11th fret on the E string and the B string. Then he goes to the 12th fret on the B string. So that's... And then that's where he gets a little bit of chromatic movement in there. And that's basically sliding from the 10th fret to the 9th fret on the E string. So that's... Then he goes down to the 11th fret of the B string. Then he does what I consider the second part of the phrase. That was all the first part. Then this, which is basically the 13th fret of the E string pulling off to the 9th fret of the E string to the 12th fret of the B string. Then you do that again from the 13 to the 9th fret of the E string. But this time you roll your finger down to the 9th fret of the B string and you slide down to the 8th fret of the B string. So that section is... And the two together sound like... And then he goes from the 11th fret to the 9th fret on the B string. The whole thing. Then he kind of rolls over again from the 9th fret of the B string to the 9th fret of the G string to the 10th fret of the G string. Then he slides down from the I think from the 8th fret to the 7th fret on the B string. Let me play that. Right. And then he plays that note on the 6th fret, and then that's the end of that phrase. So the first phrase is... The second phrase is... And it ends there. Now, this phrase is very reminiscent of this. Right? When you did that first altered scale kind of thing. That's the same as down here. So again, that's where those little motifs come in. And I don't know if they're just shapes that he is familiar with playing and they just come out in his playing, but in this solo, he's just done that twice. And this is what kind of really ties the whole solo together. So again, we have... and there's a rest right before that note, and then there's another rest. So I'm sorry, there's a rest between this and that note, and then it goes into the third part of the phrase, which is and that's the end of that phrase, and there's a rest there. So that is when you shift down from the 7th fret to the 6th fret of the B string, it goes from the 6th fret of the B string to the 7th fret of the E string to the 8th fret of the B string to the 6th fret of the E string. So that's... Then it does that half step above, half step below of the 9, 7 to 8 on the B string. So that's... Then he bends with the bar that 7th fret of the B string and brings it back up. And he just pulls off from the 9 to this, the 7 to the 6 on the B string, then the 8 to the 6 on the G string, goes back to the 8 on the G string, and does a chromatic movement. So, and this, he goes from the 5th fret of the B string to the 7th fret of the G string to the 4th fret of the B string up to the 6th fret of the B string, and that's the end of that phrase, and there's a 16th note rest there. So the whole thing is... Then he goes into this section where it's the 4th fret on the G string to the 6th fret to 4th fret on the B string, back to the 4th fret on the G string, down to the 6/4 on the D string. So it's... So that whole thing is... Then he goes into this thing where it's... And that's just the 6th and 4th fret on the E string and the G string, and you're skipping the B string. So that's 6 to 4 on the E string to the 6 to 4 on the G string. And then you hammer back on the 6th fret of the... so you pull off 6, 4, 6 on the G string. And then you play the 4th fret on the E string. So that's... Then you play 4, 6 to 4 again. 4, 6 on G string and 4th fret on the E string. So that's... Then it slides down a half step to the 3rd fret on the E string. So one more time, the whole thing. And again, after this phrase, there's a rest. Then it goes. Then he goes from the 6th fret to the 3rd fret of the B string, back to the 6 to 4 on the B string. Then it just goes down the pentatonic scale from the 5 to 3 on the G string to the 5th fret on the D string. And then he does... He plays the 5th fret of the G string twice, pulls off to the 3rd fret of the G string, and then he goes down that tritone again, which is the 5th fret of the G string to the 5th fret of the D string. So the whole thing so far is... And then he gets back into that phrase of... which is pulling the 4th fret to the 3rd fret on the D string and going down to the minor 3rd or the 6th fret of the A string. Then he does a few other things. But anyway, so that's the whole thing basically. All right, so now let's just break down what that whole thing's doing. As I described before, we're not going to get too in depth into this thing. As far as note-wise and all that kind of stuff, because I think the way I looked at it is it was broken into sections, and it's more based off of patterns and shapes more than it is thinking scales and all that kind of stuff. But it is definitely moving with the chords that are going by, and we'll talk about that. So the beginning of this, again, starts out with the bend, and then he dives down, and that's over the F minor chord. And now the beginning of this run is basically over the F minor chord, and it's... And then when it goes down to here, that's the C minor chord. So this, you could think of in this pentatonic scale using that 9th. Right? It's just... Then it goes down to this. And that is just, again, more shapes that I'm seeing out of this C minor pentatonic with that one extension note up there. You have a 9th there, which is not in the pentatonic scale, but it's commonly used. So you have those 3 notes are pentatonic. And that's just kind of a chromatic pattern going from the minor 3rd to the flat 7, major 7, 9th to flat 9. So back to the flat 7, which is part of the pentatonic scale. That's all what I consider shape 1. So then it goes into pattern or shape 2, which is... And that's shape 3. And that, to me, is, again, is reminiscent of that shape up there. But it's basically playing that major 7. Again, this section is all over the C minor also. So you have... And this is kind of like a... thinking of half step above and then resolving down. So you have this flat major 7 to the 4th to the flat 9 to the what would be the minor 6 sliding down to the 5th. So which over C looks like everything's sliding up a half step, like the pentatonic, but you're raising that note to the 4th, so... That's what it looks like to me, as far as what he's thinking. We can go into what scale it might be based off of, but to me, I'm just seeing a pentatonic scale moved up a half step, and playing that note, which is really in the real C minor pentatonic. So that's where I was saying at the very beginning, you could take these shapes and immediately insert them into your playing. Because this is just, again, in theory, playing pentatonic up a half step. So if you have a line that's kind of... you can just kind of move that up a half step. Now, you don't want to play it too long because then it just sounds like it's completely out. But if you have... that was just moving things up a half step and thinking of a note a half step above or below the note you normally would play in the pentatonic scale. Not a great example, but whatever. So that's all I'm thinking that pattern is. Then when he does this, again, I'm thinking of this pentatonic scale. That's that one that's behind the first one you always learn. I should learn the positions, what everybody calls it. I never learned, like, this is position 1, position 2. I just learned these are all your pentatonic shapes. But it's the one behind the first one. And again, I just see that pattern with this note and then this chromatic walk down to a target note. So really I'd see, but you're inserting. And then you just walk down this. Then this is a chromatic shift to the next pattern. So you have... that's just that typical walk down we did in the Alan Hines lesson where you could do that, or you could do it on the same... it's just a very typical chromatic movement to get you from one position to the next. Now, the next part of the lick, now that was all over C minor. Now the next part goes into A flat. So you have... when it goes into this A flat dominant, that's where it does the... and that, if you look at that over the A flat dominant 7 chord, it's just playing this, which is the major 6 to the 5th, to the minor 3rd, to the root, to the flat 7. So it's really just like an arpeggio. Now again, that's something you can easily throw in your own playing. If you're playing in the key of E, it's just a simple idea to take out of all this. And that's the cool thing. You take these short ideas, these short motifs, and that's the way you try and incorporate them into your own playing. Because if you just steal this whole line and play it over a solo, it's like, okay, I know exactly where that came from. But if you just hear in the middle of a solo... you'll never know where that came from, and it's a cool, unique kind of lick. Then it goes to this section. It plays that once over the A7 chord, and again, that's your 9th to your root, to your 4th or 11th to your minor 3rd. But you can think of that out of pentatonic again with that 9th. That's why it works there. Then when it goes down to this G7, that's your G7 alter, your 5 chord. This is where you can get some dissonance. And he plays that same pattern, which is basically your flat 9, your minor 3rd, and then your sharp, your flat 5, and your major 3rd. So you get that flat 9 and sharp 5 in there, which sounds great over an alter chord. Just sounds really good. Then he resolves down, though, to the G note, which makes it work. So you have... and then he just walks down basically a C Dorian scale on the C chord. So that's the long-winded explanation of how I saw this. But to me, it really helps to break all that down because I can use it now. Instead of just one long lick, I can actually use bits and pieces of that in my soloing. So anyway, I hope you really enjoyed this lesson. This was, again, this is one of my all-time favorite live solos of Scott Henderson because there's so much useful stuff. We got another Scott Henderson lesson coming up that's based off of a song called Creepin' Terror. It is my all-time favorite Scott Henderson recorded solo for an album. It's just awesome. Really cool. And I talked about it in another lesson, and it really coincides with one of the Guthrie lessons that I did as far as this. It's a different version of a similar blues solo. So anyway, I hope you stick around for that. I hope you really like this. Sorry it was a little drawn out. There's a lot of details to it. And check out guitarbreakdown.com. We got a lot of stuff coming up, a ton of more lessons. And please keep liking us, subscribing, and giving us feedback because we really like your comments. We're getting a lot of requests, and we're trying to get to those. We got a lot of requests for Bad Asteroids, the jazzy section which we already did a lesson on, but we're also getting a lot of requests for the whole song. And I don't know if we're going to be able to do the whole song. I don't think so, but a lot of people have been talking about that intro melody and not having a hard time with that. So we might do a quick, like, single lesson on that. So stick around for that stuff, and thanks again for stopping by. I really appreciate it.